Hello, anatomy students, and welcome to lecture one of our summer online course. This is Megan Knoll, I'm your instructor, and let's work our way through this very first lecture. So, by now you have looked at the syllabus lecture, you have looked at you've looked at the syllabus video, you've looked at the book video, and you're like, okay, cool, now where's the content for this course? Well, this is part one of that content, so let's get started. Okay, this lecture covers chapter 1 in your textbook. Please make sure that you have access to it, but let's go through it because to look at it at once, it's kind of a lot of information without a lot of context, so let's give us that context. Normally in an introductory anatomy class, you would also be dissecting a cat because there are lots of cats available, not a lot of human bodies available for dissection. If you want to look into the history of how people started learning about human anatomy through cadavers, it's very interesting. But beyond the scope of this course, but I highly recommend it. Look into oh no, what are their names? Something in Burke. Look into the Burking method. It's terrifying and fantastic. Okay, but why do we also normally look at the dissection of the cat? It's because the cat structure and most mammalian structure is very similar to human structure, which is why I find this very hilarious picture useful in class because it's showing a guy dancing with a cat. I don't know. You guys, I love weird anatomy pictures. They're part of why I teach. And it does show you exactly like they have the same muscles. They have the same basic structures. It's just how those structures are working together. They're a little different. We'll just leave it there. One thing we don't do in this class as an online class is look into cat anatomy because we don't need it as a model since everything we're doing is online. So we look straight at human figures instead. Okay, so you may hear me call this class anatomy instead of human biology. And human biology it's actually a very huge scope. It's a very big word. Basically, biology means everything living, so everything living about a human. Technically, this class is anatomy and physiology, and there's a nice difference between that. Anatomy is when you look at the structure of the body, while physiology is when you look at how something functions. So, for example, I am a comparative physiologist, which means that I study the physiology of animals other than human in comparison to humans. So basically, I look at how hormones, or used to look at how hormones in sharks and stingrays, as well as in rats and sparrows, work in comparison to humans, partly as a way to understand how humans work better, and partly as a way as conservation for those animals, not rats and sparrows. They're doing fine, but for sharks and stingrays, turns out sharks are not good at handling stress because in the natural environment, they don't have, a lot of the top predators don't have anything else that eats them. That's why they're top predators. And a lot of those top predators are sharks. And so therefore, if we stress them out as humans, it kills them. So what lessons from that can we learn as humans? That is comparative physiology. Now, this course doesn't go into that much detail, as far as the shark side, obviously, but it does look at two major functions in human biology, and that is the anatomy of the human body, so the structure of the body as a whole, and as the individual parts of the body, and then the physiology of the human body, or how the human body functions. So, for example, this weird-looking picture here is we'll turn this on, but we'll turn that off. This is a figure from your book where we're looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which is something it's a part of the brain that sits right above your soft palate in your mouth, and the ovary, which if you are a biological female, you have. And this is showing, so the anatomy of this would be, okay, so the hypothalamus has this little stem coming down, and then the pituitary has these two lobes. That's the anatomy. The physiology, so anatomy is the structure, okay? How does this compare to other animals? That would be comparative anatomy. The physiology of this is, what does this do? What does it do? What is the point? What is the function of it? And the function of the pituitary and the hypothalamus is to release hormones that then control the release of further hormones that control the ovary. So that's the physiology of the pituitary. One of the many physiologies of the pituitary. We'll get into that later. But you'll notice, again, the anatomy and the physiology, they work together, but they are different. Cat's doing something weird. Okay, moving on. They don't like me talking about dissecting cats. So why does this class exist? This class exists because humans love to organize things. Okay, so the figure we're using as kind of the icon for this class is this diagram from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, where he looked at how human bones work together and then how the muscles work with the bones. He did a lot of anatomy and physiology studies because before the Renaissance, people kind of were like, Don't touch it. No, don't. It's not your business to know what's happening in the body in a lot of cultures, not all of them. And so it took people being like, wait, maybe we should know what's happening inside the body to take care of ourselves a little bit better before people were like, oh, okay, maybe we should have something called anatomy and physiology. And that actually led to a medical revolution as on top of everything else that was happening in the Renaissance. But basically, it comes down to this idea that humans love to organize. The way our brain works is it likes to, the very first thing it does is it says, huh, what's that thing? Is it dangerous or is it not dangerous? Can I eat it or is it going to eat me? Can I make babies with it or not? Okay, so those are some basic evolutionary things that living organisms are always worrying about. Okay, am I predator or prey in this situation? Is that food or does it want to eat me, and how is that going to help me reproduce? Okay, so your book goes into more detail on some of the characteristics of life, but because this is an anatomy course and not technically a biology course, we're not going to go into that in super detail. You have enough to learn just learning the the anatomy and the physiology. But there is this interesting link that I have for you called The Scale of the Universe, and it's this interesting applet where so by that I mean you have to allow Adobe to access Adobe Acrobat to work something. Anyway, the point being that you can zoom in and you can zoom out, and it gives you some relative idea of how big stuff is in comparison to other people. So if you were taking an astronomy class, you would zoom out and you would look at things on the scale of this big, right? So you'd be looking at stars and planets and galaxies, etc. But in an anatomy class, we are going to zoom in and we're going to look at things starting on the scale of humans, right? Boom. We're about a meter, 2 meters tall, not 2 meters tall, pretty tall, right? So 1.7 meters-ish. Some people are 2 meters. That means you're about 6 feet tall, okay, etc. Yes, there are crabs that are bigger than us. They're very rare, but they exist. People like to eat their legs. Yes, the T-Rex is about the same size as an elephant. Not for this class. Okay, so we're going to exist on this scale, and then we're going to get smaller. Okay, so what that means is we're going to go into the human, and we're going to say, cool, if that's how big a human is, then how big is, let's see. When do we get into some more human biology? Well, there's the biggest bacteria. We can actually see the biggest bacteria. Well, we can kind of almost see the biggest bacteria. Cool. Well, there's amoebas, parameciums. Those can infect human bodies depending on them. Oh, look, there's the human egg. And it's about the width of a human hair. So that's the kind of scale we deal with in anatomy. You will see in physiology, you're going to start looking at stuff even smaller. The part that students don't like very much is when we talk about cells, and we go into some deep stuff about DNA and macromolecules and things like, here's how big DNA is compared to the cell membrane, etc. Okay, so that shows you how small things get for this class. Even then, that's not as small as things get. So there's glucose. We're going to talk a lot about glucose because even if you're on a carb-free diet, you still need glucose or you'll die. Don't worry, you get plenty of it. And so we'll talk a lot about that. But again, this is just another example that humans love to organize things. It makes our brains happy when we understand, and really understanding is helping us organize things. Okay, enough about those. Let's go back. Sometimes it's just fun to play with that. Okay, so that is why this kind of class exists. So one way that we like to organize things is by putting things in order of biggest to smallest. So take a second to kind of pause and say, okay, what is the biggest thing here? What's the smallest thing? How do they go in order? Ready? I'm going to let you pause. Oh, by the way, I highly recommend you take notes during these lectures. You can't just turn it on and then kind of do nothing because your brain will start to veg out. It'll just be like, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? Why am I itchy? What's happening? Is my dog doing something? What's that guy doing? Okay, so you should make sure you are also taking notes while you're doing this. One way you can do it is if you have access to a printer, you can print out these slides and take notes on them. You could also just take notes in a notebook. Obviously, I'm not checking your notes, but a lot of research shows that by taking notes, you activate your brain, especially by hand, you activate your brain much better than if you're just listening to something, and especially if you're not really actively listening. So I will will admit I often will go to meetings and not actively listen, and then have no idea what's happening. So please make sure you're taking notes, and will help you to help your brain organize this into something that's important. Okay. So where were we? We were saying, what's the smallest thing here? What's the biggest thing here? So I'm going to give you a couple. I'm going to pause the video. In real life, I would say I'm going to give you a couple seconds to organize these, and then we'll come back. But since that's not happening, pause the video, organize these things, and then when you're ready, click go again. Click go on the video. And you should have something that looks kind of like this, okay? And if you don't know all these words, don't worry. That's why this class exists, because you're going to know all of them by the end of the class, okay? So the smallest thing that we deal with in anatomy are atoms. If you have multiple atoms together, you can get a molecule. Once you have several molecules together, you have a macromolecule. Macro just means big, so that makes sense. Once you have a bunch of macromolecules working together, you could have an organelle. Once you have a bunch of organelles working together, you get a cell, okay? Specific cell types working together give you a tissue. And then we're going to have a whole lecture or a whole lab just on tissue types, because it's very important. For example, blood is a tissue. What? Okay, we're going to talk about it. Once you have a bunch of tissues working together and cooperating, you get an organ. And once you have organs working together, you have an organ system. And of course, an organism, especially a multicellular organism like a human, needs a whole lot of organ systems working together in order to function as a whole. And part of this is because we wouldn't be able to have we wouldn't be able to learn about our bodies if our bodies were not this complicated. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. Okay, so another way to think about this is as a hierarchy. So the biggest part is the organismal level, but you have to have the most of atoms in order to get to the organism level. Okay. By the way, if any of these figures say fig, blah, 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 that means it comes directly from your textbook. I also like to put in a lot of figures from other places, so you can kind of get, so the idea is you're not just memorizing the figure you're looking at, you're memorizing you're learning the material you actually need for the class. And if you're looking at this and you're saying, why won't she just full screen the slides? It doesn't work with the recording software I'm using. I know, it makes me crazy too. Okay, so this class, we like to look at the individual organ systems and look at them, how they function independently, and then also how they talk to each other. Okay, so we will come back to this, but these are the systems we're going to look at. We're going to look at the urinary, let's zoom in. Okay, we're going to look at the urinary system, the respiratory system, and these are some things that you should know, like the basic organs for. Okay, so the digestive system has the stomach, the large and small intestine, the esophagus. Okay, if you're going from top to bottom, you get the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the gallbladder, the liver, I guess, can be part of this system, the large intestines, the rectum. Okay, the lymphatic system, you're not going to have to know all of these organs, so there are some you will need to know, such as the appendix and the thyroid or the parathyroid. Yeah, we'll talk about the tonsils specifically. Okay, the the respiratory system is going to include the lungs and the trachea and some other things we'll talk about. The urinary system is literally where urine is coming from. That's going to be your kidneys and your bladder. The reproductive system, depending on biological male versus female. And we will talk about the differences between gender and biological sex later, but just in very general terms, I'll be saying biological male versus biological female, not to be any kind of trans exclusionary or anything, but just to keep it on the biology side for now, before we get into the psychology side later, which is very complicated and interesting. The integumentary system, that's all of your skin. That is your biggest organ because it literally covers your entire body, and it's actually pretty complicated. The skeletal system is all of your bones. Bones, you may think of them as these kind of boring, dry things, but they're actually very complicated and interesting. Your muscular system works off of your bones to function. So I'm doing that. Your nervous system is what controls everything. That's your brain, your spinal cord, and all of the nerves that go and make stuff happen. And the cardiovascular is your veins, your heart, your veins and your arteries, and your capillaries. And my very favorite system is the endocrine system, which gets like 2 lectures because it is bananas and a hodgepodge because it's just I love it. You'll see. Well, don't worry about it right now. The thing we're going to worry about right now is how do we talk about these things? How do we have a general anatomical language so that we can talk about these things no matter where you are? If you're watching a Grey's Anatomy episode, they do really good. They're really careful to make sure they work with doctors and anatomists to label things correctly. So you may have heard stuff like make a lateral incision on the blah, 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 and 50 C's and blah, blah, blah. So if nothing else from this lecture, you'll learn how to interpret Grey's Anatomy's episodes perfectly. Okay, at least the science stuff. I actually went to a lecture once by one of the writers, and he said when they're writing, they just leave, they don't know the words all the time, so they just put, give me 50 medical, 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 and they just put the word medical, and then someone medical comes in and like puts the real words for what they're looking for there. Interesting. But so what are those words? Some of them are a lot of what we're talking about today, which are the planes of the body, the directions, and the cavities. So these are kind of, none of these things fit into the systems that we were talking about here, but they relate to all of them. So this is how we talk about the body, like when we're talking about directions in the body, because we can't just say, use the right atrium, because are we talking about my right? Are we talking about your right? Well, technically, we're always going to be talking about the patient's right. So if you are the patient and you say right atrium, we're talking about your right. But if you're a doctor looking at a patient and you say right, it's the patient's right. Okay. But also, we can't use words like north or south or this way or that way or front or back, because what if we need some sort of unifying language. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the bulk of this lecture, even though we're already 15 minutes in. Okay, so let's talk about it. The first thing we're going to talk about is why these, like I was just saying, so these terms exist because we can't just say north or south or east or west, because first of all, people don't always remember what those terms are, and also what if someone is laying down? Is what's north then? Is it their whatever? No, I don't know. So that's why we have these. We want to make sure that no matter how a patient or a person or a cat or whatever is laying or acting or whatever, we still know what direction things are and where to do things. Okay, you may have heard horror stories about like people writing in Sharpie on their legs, this leg, not the other leg. Okay, just because they're worried that something might be lost in translation between like I need you to operate on my right leg versus like my lateral blah blah blah. Okay, so this is where that language it should be really made sure that you understand really well, which is a bad sentence. And so one of the things we have to think about is how do we develop this language? It all happens when the body is in what's called anatomical position. So anatomical position is when you face forward, you stand erect. Okay, you stand up. You hold your arms at your side with your palms facing forward. Now, that's not a natural feeling position. When you stand just naturally at neutral position, just kind of standing there, your thumbs want to move in towards the body. Okay, they want to kind of go this way. But the anatomical position is where you move those thumbs away, or you move them laterally, is what we're going to see. That's why that's called. And the reason why you'll see when we do bones, it makes your humerus and your ulna, your radius and your ulna, you guys, the quarantine is getting to me. It makes your radius and your ulna not cross over each other. So they're lying flat. Okay, so you could see if you go back to our little circle of people standing around with various pieces of their body standing out, which ones are in anatomical position. I'm going to give you a couple seconds. Ready? Okay. So the ones in anatomical position are the guys, so the biological male ones that they just copied and pasted into the, okay? You can tell he's standing erect, or even if he's laying down, it looks like he could be standing erect, and his thumbs are pointing outward. His arms are at his side, his thumbs are pointing outward. The biological female, the thumbs are pointing kind of straight forward, or to they're pointing medially or towards the middle. Why? Maybe the artist just wanted to be fancy. Maybe the artist doesn't know what anatomical position is. Either way, we could look at this immediately and say, you are not in anatomical position, lady, because your thumbs are not pointed outwards. Okay? Fun fact, tell your friends. Okay, so that's not all. So in anatomical position, we can then start to make directional terminology. Okay, so if we kind of cut the body straight down the center in the midline, okay, we have right and left, obviously, okay, but that's not all. So we have right and left, and then we also have medial versus lateral. So I've already said the word medial and lateral. Medial means you are towards the middle. Lateral means you are towards the side. Okay, you are away from that midline. Okay, so the thumb in anatomical position is lateral to the pinky because it is away from the midline. Okay, we're going to go through all these terms in more detail. I love this figure from your book. It's a nice It's nice to see it's not just a naked dude in his underwear. So it's nice to see a female anatomical person in the correct position. You will see these directional terms usually paired with their opposite. So we have superior versus inferior. Superior is towards the head, inferior is down. Lateral and medial are opposites. We also see proximal and distal. We'll talk about it all. All right. And where did these terms even come from? These terms come from what are called the body planes. So the body planes are basically imaginary lines drawn through specific parts of the body so you can cut them into sections. Okay, if you've ever watched the movie The Cell or that TV show Hannibal, there are some really creepy, gross scenes where they cut people into these sagittal sections. Sagittal, medial? Again, one does the other, and then just like spread them out, and it's kind of gross and creepy, but it does show you some interesting anatomy. Don't do it in both of those cases, people are being murdered. Don't do that in real life, okay? In medical terms, there's actually also a very cool kind of study that was done where they took somebody who donated their body to science and did all of these slices through their body about a centimeter thick so that you can literally go through them like a library to see what is where in the body. It's very bananas. It's fantastic. But okay, so we have 3 planes. 4, kind of. Really, it's 3. Okay, here's a figure from your book. Also fantastic. Shows you that we have the frontal line or coronal plane. The frontal or coronal plane is where we divide into the front and the back. Technically, we don't like the words front and back. We talk about anterior and posterior. So if someone ever says something about your posterior, they're talking about your butt. So rude, okay? Or maybe, who knows? Consent is important. So the frontal or coronal plane divides you into posterior and anterior, front and back. The sagittal plane, usually we think about the sagittal plane going straight, like right, dividing your body into left and right. Okay. You could, though, be off of that line, that center line, and be off a little bit. And then it goes from being a median sagittal plane to a parasagittal. Para means like close to or almost. And so it's still sagittal, though, because it's going up and down through the body. And then a transverse plane is that horizontal plane where you get cross sections. Well, we kind of talk about it as cross sections. If you're looking at a tube rather than a human, we talk about these a little bit differently, but there's a nice figure in your book about it. Okay, so that horizontal plane or that transverse plane divides you into top and bottom. Okay, we don't talk about top and bottom though. We talk about superior and inferior. Now, there's no one place where suddenly everything becomes superior and everything becomes inferior. Instead, what's happening is it's all relative to everything else. So the head is superior to the elbow, okay? But the elbow is superior to the belly button, okay? So it's all relative to each other, okay? The knee is superior to the ankle because it's above it, but it's inferior to the hip, okay? So superior, inferior is basically top and bottom, but anatomical, okay? And that's done with the transverse plane. There's a couple other words related to this, and they have to do with animal science. Though we also use cranial a lot in human biology. So cranial means anything associated with the head, while caudal means anything associated with the sacral part of your body, which is your butt bone, basically. Not your butt bone, it's your sacral bone, it's your tailbone. And that is because it's also referring to tail. So you hear about caudal fins a lot in animal biology because it's talking about tail functions. Okay, so the cat has this would be the cranium and then the caudal section. But it's weird to think about because the cat has to be in human anatomical positioning as well in order to get those same terminology. But we don't see that in cats. They are on all fours. So in that case, we're using a different plane. We'll talk about it later. Anyway, the point of this being cranial, if you ever see cranial, that means towards the head, while caudal means to down your spinal cord. Okay, so it's kind of another way to talk about inferior. All right, what about that medial plane that divides things left and right? This, when we divide things left and right, we talk about things, either they're going to be on the left or the right, or they're going to be medial or lateral to each other, okay? So the heart is medial to the lungs, okay? The lungs are lateral to the heart because they're away from that midline, okay? Cool. Excellent. Easy peasy. Really medial lateral is one of the easiest things. And you're going to see this a lot in the bone section when we talk about the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle, or the medial, Oh, there's other one. There's many more. And it's going to be important in how the bone is positioned, and if you can tell if it's a right or a left bone, which becomes important. Let's talk about it later. Just remember, medial means towards the midline. Lateral means away from the midline. Cool. What about that frontal or coronal plane that divides you into a front and a back section? In anatomical terminology, we don't say front and back. We say ventral or anterior, which means the front side. Ventral also kind of makes me think of visceral, which means organs. And dorsal or posterior means the back or the butt side, right? You might think of a dorsal fin in a shark or a dolphin. That is their back side, okay? So anytime that plane is separating things to front and back, we're talking about so ventral, let's see, like your stomach is ventral to your spinal cord because it is in front of your spinal cord, but we don't say in front of in anatomy, we say ventral or anterior. It's interesting. You usually hear ventral in terms, a lot of times we talk about ventral when we're talking about the guts, and anterior when we're talking about the head. That's not always true, but it is an interesting thing you might see pop up. Same thing with dorsal and posterior. We'll talk about them. A lot of these things will make a lot more sense in context, and you'll see that in the lab. Okay, other directional terminology, which are not about breaking the body up into those three specific planes. There is proximal and distal. These always have to be done in reference to other things, and it's always about those extremities, your arms and your legs, okay? And it's about how close something is to something else. So if something is proximal, it's close to whatever you're looking at, and if it's distal, it's further away, okay? So let's put this up here. So the proximal, if you're talking about the elbow is okay, so if you're talking about it as a whole, the shoulder is proximal while the hand is distal. It's further along that thing. If you're talking about the elbow is, well, let's do it this way. It's always hard to think of good examples. The wrist is distal to the elbow, okay? But it's proximal to the shoulder. If we're looking at in comparison to the hand. You'll see these in a lot. It'll be like when we talk about the distal phalanx or the proximal, etc. This will make more sense. But let's see, what's another good example that I have in my notes? The ankle is distal and the knee is proximal to the hip. So the ankle is further away than the knee is to the hip. Okay, that's a good way to think about it. All right, cool. So now we've talked about the general terms. We've got superior, inferior, we've got posterior, anterior, we've got proximal, distal, we've got medial, lateral. Let's talk about some other ways to talk about the body. And one way is to look at the body cavity. So your body is basically a bunch of bones and muscles and then sacs of organs. It's not very cute, but that's sadly what's happening. Okay, so the body cavities are the spaces within the body that contain your vital organs. Everything else is going to be muscle and bone. Okay, so there's two big body cavities, two main ones that we care about. We have the dorsal, oh look, there's that term, dorsal or posterior cavity, and then we have the ventral or anterior cavity. So remember, dorsal means the back, towards the back, and ventral or anterior means towards the front. Oh, we're already using those terms. Okay, so this is important. The dorsal cavity contains different stuff than the ventral cavities. Okay, well, if you look at someone in anatomical position straight on, you're only going to see, you're going to see both. You're going to see the dorsal cavity when you're talking about the cranial cavity, where the brain is, but you're also mostly going to see the ventral cavity because the ventral cavity is going to be it's ventral to the dorsal cavity. Oh, one thing we didn't talk about is deep versus superficial. So and I need to put that in here. So deep versus superficial. Deep means it's deeper into the body. Superficial means it's on top. So your skin is superficial to your stomach, okay, because it's on top. I'm going to put that in the lab. Okay. All right, so let's talk about each of these cavities. Whoops. Oh, sorry for the mic spike. Okay. The dorsal or posterior cavity is the one that runs along, it goes from your brain all the way down to the bottom of where your spine is, and it contains the brain and the spine. It has the cranial cavity. Remember, cranial means anterior, or head in this case, and it contains the spinal cavity, which is where the spine is. That's it. That's all there is to that one. The abdominal cavity or the ventral and anterior cavities, they get more complicated. So sorry, the ventral or anterior cavities there's actually 2.5-ish, okay? So this contains the thoracic, okay, and the abdominopelvic, okay, which you can break down into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. But really what's the reason why we separate these the way we do is that the thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominopelvic cavity by the diaphragm. Okay, so the diaphragm, that this word, which looks crazy, is a muscle that causes your lungs to inflate and deflate, and it keeps these two cavities separate. Another thing it keeps these two cavities separate is there is a membrane, basically the sac-like structure, that holds all of these organs in place, and then there's another membrane that holds all of these organs in place, and we're going to talk a lot about those membranes in a few seconds. But let's talk first about this, the thoracic cavity. Okay, so we are looking at a frontal view here, which is where we've cut front and back, or anterior and posterior, and we can see the lungs in this thoracic cavity, and we can see the heart. Oh no, is this heart dying? No, this heart, it's fine. You have to have some fat in your body or you'll die. So that's what's happening. Okay, so the thoracic cavity contains the mediastinum, which is the middle of all the things, and guess what's in there? The heart. And this is what you need to know, is what's in what cavity, okay? So the mediastinum has the heart and a bunch of the major arteries and veins. So the vena cava, the aortic arch, that's this guy. The vena cava is this one, okay? And the vena cava is separated into the superior vena cava, the one above, and the inferior vena cava. It doesn't mean it's worse. It doesn't mean it's not as good. It means it's below, okay? So the esophagus, which is where food goes. The trachea, which is where, this is the trachea here. You can tell because it has these cartilage ribs, basically. Okay, we'll get into it. It contains the heart and it contains the large blood vessels. Okay, so that is the mediastinum. It also, the pleural cavity, so you're going to see this word pleura or pleural anytime you're talking about lungs, okay? So because it means, it's like from Latin to breathe or something. So those two cavities are on either side, or those two like sections, and they're all within the thoracic cavity. Now, why do they get individual names? Because they each have individual membranes separating them from everything else. We'll talk about it. Don't worry, I got you. All right, so let's go into the more complicated abdominal or abdominopelvic cavity. We can separate this into the upper and lower parts. So if we have the thoracic, which contains the lungs and the heart, very basically, we then have the abdominal and the pelvic cavities, which technically are not actually separated. We can divide these a bunch of different ways. So the upper part contains a lot of the digestive organs. So you have your stomach, your small intestines, most but not all of the large intestines, the appendix, which people are still on the fence about, but it's probably involved actually in immuno stuff, in immune system stuff, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and the spleen. And I'm saying these words because you should know where these things are very generally located for your lab. Talk about that later. The lower abdominal cavity, or the pelvic cavity. Okay, so why are these separated? I mean, we like to separate them why are they separated when really they aren't separated? A lot of it goes back to Victorian era stuff where they're like, oh, don't talk about the pelvic cavity. That's where reproduction and poop happen. And we don't want to think about those at all. Oh, mercy me, how? Oh. But actually, we know as anatomists that that's actually a very bad way to think about things, because you can't be awkward and kind of like trying to be proper when talking about medical things, because you could do bad by your patient. You could do wrong by your patient or by yourself, because if you're like, something's wrong with my reproductive system, but I can't talk to anyone about it because it's improper. Well, what if you have cancer? What if you have an infection? And if you don't talk to anyone about it, you could die. So again, we are no longer in the world where we are worried about, oh no, am I going to embarrass somebody by saying the word penis? No, we're in anatomy. We say these words because they are biology words. They're not a problem, okay? So that pelvic cavity we now know is actually technically is part of the abdominal pelvic cavity as a big whole, and it contains the urinary bladder, the reproductive organs, and the last part of the large intestines, which is involved with fecal matter, okay? Again, oh no, the dirty things. No, it's not dirty. It's just anatomy. Everything's fine. All right, so we can further break these things down because if you were to do a dissection on a cat, or if you do a dissection on a human, it's not called a dissection, it's called an autopsy. Okay. If you just cut open the abdominopelvic cavity, you suddenly see so many things. And one thing that doctors like to do is they like to say things like let's say the pancreas has extended into the upper right quadrant, or the pancreas has retreated into the blah, 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 etc. Okay, so the reason why we have these quadrants, and all you need to worry about is this 4-quadrant system, not this crazy system. This does go into more detail, and as you go higher in your anatomy classes, you will need to know this level of detail. But for all we care about, all I care about in this class is that if I were to say, look at this quadrant system and tell me what organs are in them, you would be able to say, okay, the liver only exists in the upper right and the upper left quadrant. The small intestines, though, is in all 4 quadrants. Or if I say, where can you find the pancreas, you would say, oh, it's in the right quadrants, the 2 right quadrants, etc. Okay, actually, I guess this is supposed to be the large intestine. So where is the large intestine? It's actually in all 4 quadrants. You can go into more detail in your book to get more idea of what is in which section. Okay, it's actually part of your lab. All right. Let's talk about one last cavity, which isn't really a cavity, but it's the retroperitoneal space. Don't worry too much about that word. What you need to know is that the kidneys and the adrenal glands are actually not technically in the abdominal cavity. Now, if you were to do a dissection and you pull out all of these organs, you would see the kidneys behind everything. And you'd be like, hello, obviously they're in this cavity. But technically they're not. They exist outside the membranes that hold all of these guts together. So technically, they're outside of the abdominal cavity. They're actually behind or posterior to all of those guts, all of those organs, okay? They are also, if you're going from, if you're doing a dissection from the this way and going down into the body, again, you're getting deeper into the body. So the stomach is, it is superficial to the kidneys, which exists in its own space. Okay. What? Okay, so you've been talking about these organs, Noel. What does that mean? Oh, don't worry, I got you. So these organs, when I'm talking about these organs, these membranes, sorry, what does that mean? So all of our body cavities are lined with a, it's like a Ziploc bag, a membrane that's basically holding everything in so nothing ruptures. It's like having a balloon inside of a balloon with Vaseline between the layers. Because if you think about it, every time you move, you're putting frictional pressure on everything inside of your body. So if those organ cavities were not surrounded with some sort of like slippery surface, they would rupture like a balloon being squished too much. Okay, so it's actually very, very important that we have these what are called serous membranes, not serious, but serous membranes that keep everything lubricated. Okay, so a membrane is just anything that keeps everything into a certain place. So you've heard of the cell membrane. It holds all of the DNA and cell organs all together into one cell. Well, the serous membranes surround your internal organs and line the body cavities and keep everything in place. Not only do they keep everything in place, they make sure that everything stays moist and friction free. So as your heart beats, it's not rubbing against the lungs and like ripping pieces of the lung off. That would be very bad for you. Instead, the heart has several membranes. Whee! Okay, so we have the heart is surrounded by the, had 2 different membranes, the visceral pericardia, and then there's a cavity, and then the parietal pericardia. Now you might say, there's so many words, because oh my God, look at all these words you have to learn about it. But don't worry, there's a trick to it. Okay, so if you see the word cardi, like Cardi B, but not, cardi means heart. Okay, so if you see cardi, you know you're talking about the heart. If you see the word plural, like this spelled this way, remember you're talking about the lungs. And if you see peritoneum, you're talking about the guts. How am I supposed to remember that pleura is from the word to breathe from the Greek or maybe Latin? Peritoneum means around the thing. It doesn't mean anything. It means around the hole. There's no help there. Okay, so what does this mean? So this means that, so what else, how else can I remember these things? So you'll notice for every cavity, there are at least two different serous membranes. Okay, so the heart has the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. So parietal always touches the cavity wall. So if you're building a person, like let's say you're making a clay person and you put a little, like make a cavity in them so that you can put the heart in there, where you're going to put your finger in there and make a little cavity. Then you're going to line it with the parietal pericardium. So you're going to put that first layer of membrane in there. You're going to put some Vaseline or whatever in there, some like goopy, nice non-friction stuff. And then you're going to put in another membrane, which is the visceral pericardium. And then you're going to put the heart in, and then you can close it all up. Okay, same thing with the lungs. The lungs are surrounded, the lungs themselves touch the visceral pleura. And then that whole bag of lungs and visceral pleura is surrounded by the parietal pleura, and that touches the cavity's wall. Okay, so the wall of the cavity is always going to be the parietal bleh, whatever. The visceral, the thing that touches the organ, is always going to be the visceral bleh, whatever. Okay. The mesentery is it's a whole other sac that, or like membrane sac, that contains all of the organs in the digestive system, where people are thinking there might actually be some sort of hormonal system that's communicating between the mesentery and the rest of the digestive system. It's likely because, remember, the serous membrane is made of cells, and cells have lots of different functions. Okay. And so there was a big news article a few years ago that was like, science has discovered another organ that nobody knew about, the mesentery. Now, people knew about it. It's just that we're always learning new things about our body, because if we were done, everything would be boring. But there's always something new we're learning about our body, okay? Because really, medical science has only been around for a very small part of history, so there's no way we know everything yet. But now you know everything that you need to do the lab for this class. You know all about your body cavities. Okay, you have your the major body cavities being the cranial, and then the thoracic, and the abdominopelvic. You know your terminology for getting around the body. Okay, you know your planes, the sagittal, the transverse, and the coronal planes. You know, what else do you know? Guys, you learned so much. You learned the different serous membranes, okay? And you learned how to separate the abdominal cavity into 4 parts. So now you are really ready to go to your lab. And so I'm going to stop talking here. And when you're ready, not only will you be able to do the practice quiz that follows this, you can kind of make sure you know what's what, but you will, and by the way, the practice quiz questions look a lot like the lab practical, well, not the lab practical, the lecture exam questions. So highly recommend you do them. But you're also ready to jump into the lab and start answering questions about all these different things. Okay, bye.